Well, let's get more on that, and we can speak now to Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Ambassador,
thanks for having me on, John.
In your capacity as the State Department's top Middle East diplomat back in 2024, in December of 2024, you met the new Syrian leader and the new leaders in Damascus. The United States at the time offered that new leadership support, and it seems the Trump administration has continued in the same vein. So can I assume that you agree with President Trump's strategy of welcoming President Ahmad al-Shara into the international fold?
Yes, I do. Look, I think the smart thing to do was to give him the space to succeed or fail. Give him the space to engage forthrightly in the economic realm with regional states who were very vested in the success of the new Syria and in stabilizing that country.
I mean, you were very quick getting to Damascus in December of last year. I'm just wondering why you thought it was necessary to get there as quickly as you did after the downfall of Bashar al-Assad on the 8th of December.
Well, look, I mean, it was a once-in-a-generation sort of event that you had 50-plus years of a really brutal family enterprise end in a breathtaking fashion. And the first opportunity for that country alongside Lebanon, which was starting on its own political transition. So it was a critical moment to lay eyes on and engage with this new leader, whom we knew at a distance, whom we knew principally through the prism of his previous career, fighting U.S. forces, and then gradually consolidating power in Syria over a very large swath of the country and 4 million people. So it was quite important for us to have an understanding of what he was about, what he planned, and report back, including sharing that set of impressions. And they were impressions. It was an hour-and-a-half engagement. So it couldn't be more than that, but sharing that with the incoming team.
I mean, those events in December of last year took everyone by surprise. I mean, did you see the writing on the wall for Bashar al-Assad? Did you see it coming when it came?
No, the way I thought about Syria in those last couple of years was that sooner or later, a lot of really terrible chickens would come home to roost, that there would be pressures there that would accumulate precisely because of the effect of the events of the Gaza conflict, the effect on Iran of its efforts to mobilize its axis of resistance, which ultimately against Israel, which ultimately led to a pretty shattering set of attacks by Israel against Hezbollah and a series of attacks or military exchanges between Israel and Iran. So there was always pressure that the Israelis were putting on Syria in that period. But yes, I was as surprised as anyone that all of a sudden, from one minute to the next, Assad fled. It was quite remarkable, and even the fighters themselves that made up Shara's large tent, shall we say, were surprised by how easily they swept down from Aleppo to Damascus.
Given how quickly everything happened, you didn't have much time to prepare for those early meetings. And probably the people on the other side of the table, by the sound of things, didn't have much time to prepare for those meetings either. But what was agreed on in those 1.5 hour long talks? What was committed to?
So I had about a week to prepare. I was in Amman waiting for Washington to finalize its decision that I would go in, that I would meet with al-Shara himself, that I would go in with Roger Carstens, our special envoy for hostage affairs. And so we had quite a bit of time to think through the discussion. And I had a set of messages to convey to him about sort of the primacy of certain things for us, which included, of course, the quest to find Austin, to find out what had occurred to him, to bring him home if at all possible, but also to look for other to get the commitment of that government to assist us with other such quests, but also importantly, the counterterrorism piece to pick up the fight against ISIS and carry it forth. We discussed really everything possible, including governance issues. So commitments, I would say, it was more of us laying down a set of messages, previewing that, of course, there was a new administration coming in that we could expect would have its own, of course, deliberations over how they would engage or not. But also for any U.S. government, this question of counterterrorism was going to be quite important.
You mentioned how, there was an inevitability about how things were going to be difficult for Syria in transition, especially after its history, especially after 13, 14 years of civil war. And there are today some obvious issues in Syria, particularly violence involving minorities, whether they be religious minorities, former Assad loyalists. I mean, there is a degree, isn't there, though, of inevitability about all of this, isn't there?
Look, I take I start from the perspective that as horrible and brutal as that 13, 14 years of war were, the war that Assad waged on his own people with the robust assistance of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, there was a longer history, which also was always going to make the first transitional government's task enormous. And in fact, one could argue that history shows around the world that such transitions have a very high failure rate. And look at the issues. The Assad family, father and son, spent decades setting communities against one another, not just minority against majority, but minority communities against one another, and really working to deepen cleavages all through society. And it's a way of course, keeping everybody unsettled, weakened, coup-proofing the regime, etc. But what it left was a long residue of distrust. And of course, you have places in the country, in the Northeast and in Sweden, where you've had decades of sectarian conflict. And so you take away all the trappings of a police state and everything that keeps things contained and controlled. And yes, you can expect an explosion. You can expect these historic tensions to rise up. And then there's a whole question about how Syria, the new Syria and its citizenry, how they engage and how they look at Damascus, this new Damascus. So it was always going to be very difficult. And I think one of the key tests for Shara's success, and I said this to him at the time, would be the degree to which he brought people into governance and into consultations, so that it was not just, as one Syrian said, transplanting Idlib to Damascus and trying to run the city, the country, as he had Idlib.
I mean, President Bashar has had a tough job, hasn't he, these last 9 months? I mean, we look at two countries, Israel and Turkey, that have launched military operations inside his country's borders during the last 9 months. And then, of course, we've got the Assad regime in exile. And, of course, they were masters in peddling fake information, fake news, conspiracy theories online, sowing the seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone covering Syria. I mean, have you got the impression that there have been, external forces like them trying to unsettle and really fan the flames in Syria?
No question, and we saw that within the first days after Assad fled, and Ashara came with HTS to Damascus. As you say, the disinformation and the way that social media weaponizes it, or people malefactors weaponize social media to sow all sorts of propaganda, but not just propaganda, rumor and claims and disinformation that can spark unrest. So we saw that in the first days. And although I'm not obviously privy to classified information at this point, I have to assume that is a real threat, because Iran has always taken the approach to places in the region that if they can't have it, nobody can have it. And I think that having been so thoroughly pushed out of Syria very abruptly by both the fact of the new government, but also the extreme animosity of the public towards the Iranians. The IRGC essentially fled in the night, as Assad did. So I think there will indisputably be an effort by Iran to continue to work its way back in, and if it can't, to destabilize Syria.
So just to wrap up the conversation about Syria before we move on to another subject, I mean, all things considered, 9 months on from the start of this transition, this dramatic transition in Syria, which you say took you and everyone else in the world by surprise. What are your main takeaways? Does it looking back on it, like it's been an orderly transition?
I don't think you can say it's orderly. I think it's been, with the exception of the really terrible events in July in Ceuta, and of course earlier in March on the coast, it has been a transition that has managed to avoid, for the most part, a lot of violence. And that's not insignificant. However, he is going to be tested and tested again and again. And I think one of the places to watch that is northeast Syria, where you have the same sort of fracture lines, Arab, but in this case, Kurdish divisions and cleavages and possibly armed conflict in the near term.
Ambassador, I'd like to turn our attention to what's been happening in Gaza. We're less than 3 months away from the 2-year anniversary of the 7th of October and the horrific events in Israel, but also the beginning of a horrific chapter for the people of Gaza. Why is it that peace in Gaza is proving to be so elusive?
Look, I mean, there is no question, for me at least professionally, the Gaza conflict was the hardest thing I ever worked on in my 35 plus years of diplomatic life. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to unwind. You saw remarkably huge numbers of Israelis come out in protests on Sunday in a sort of a national agony about the conflict and the desire, of course, to bring their loved ones home and also the remains of those who perished. And on the other side, you have just a terrible, terrible humanitarian situation that beggars description at this point. I think it's possible, for the first time in a while, it's possible that there will be a partial hostage deal. But the thing that remains unresolved is how to end this conflict and how to close the gap, as it were, or reconcile two really irreconcilable quests. The still unfinished Israeli war aimed to totally destroy Hamas, which by every reckoning of every military professional I've spoken to, both American, European, Arab, but also many Israelis, can't be done by military terms alone. And on the other hand, Hamas is the only standard for victory is that it survives. Well, you know, you've got 2 million people who are living in the midst of this terrible situation. So there needs to be a political resolution to it all. And I have long argued that Hamas should not be the one at the table that is the party to that negotiation, that it is unreasonable to exclude the Palestinian Authority as the partner. They are the natural partner. And then you will get the Arab community coming in behind that to help take Gaza to what it badly needs, which is out of the conflict and into a post-conflict recovery phase.
And yet, I mean, peace is looking like it maybe even further into the distance, because Israel is now planning, we're told, to carry out a military offensive to, quote, conquer Gaza City. Israel's defense minister is calling up around 60,000 reservists. I mean, that's going to make an acute humanitarian crisis even worse. Do you get the impression that Israel continues to have Washington's full blessing when it says it's going to go ahead and do something like that?
Well, I mean, the president spoke again this week and said, get on with it, destroy Hamas as fast as you can. I mean, with all due respect, that's easy to say. It's proven impossible to do. So destroy Hamas as a formal sort of terrorist army, as the Israelis have always called it, an organized military. Yes, that has been done. They are a disaggregated force. They are more of an insurgent force, which makes it all the harder to get at them in military terms, and certainly to get at them without crushing civilian casualties and damage. So that takes you to a political a resolution to all of this. They have achieved one of their most important aims, which was to destroy Hamas's military capabilities, again, as an organized force. So as many people have said, including Israelis, take the win, which is a huge one, and now pivot to the political path of what comes after, and how to govern and secure Gaza in a way that Hamas is squeezed out. But you got to squeeze them out politically, and you only do that by offering an alternative that can take that space. And it won't happen immediately. But then Israel has had decades of experience of dealing with terrorist groups, not in a one-off, one-go, get at them one time with one campaign sort of approach, but over a course of years. And this is the same thing with Hamas.
Okay, and yet here we are in a situation where it looks like there could even be an escalation in Gaza, as we've been saying, involving up to around 60,000 reservists. Just lastly, I mean, the French president's one of the world leaders who's expressed alarm at that proposition. He says it risks dragging the entire region into a state of permanent war. Those are the words of President Emmanuel Macron today. Do you share that concern?
Well, I don't know if I see it as permanent war, but certainly permanent insecurity that just spreads and spreads immutably in every direction. Permanent insecurity, permanent instability. And in fact, again, going back to Syria and Lebanon, for the first time in 4 or 5 decades, you have two pieces of what has historically been one of the most unstable parts of the region, the Levant, and which crowds upon Jordan and Iraq and Israel in security terms. You have the prospect of taking the military wins there and turning them into political capital. But that can only happen with a larger effort at stabilization. And Gaza is very much a part of that. It inflames the Arab public, and it is a seedbed for radicalization of a very dangerous kind for the future.
Ambassador Leaf, I feel like we could talk a lot longer, and I do hope you'll talk to us again in the future, especially about
Anytime,
events
Tom.
in Lebanon. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Thank you very much indeed for your time.